and I think it's really important, is for people to really, really have in their heart that their culture, most of what they're hearing from the mainstream world, mainstream psychiatry, mainstream politics, mainstream media, it's just this kind of, it's crazy ass insane kind of culture. This, you call it the traumadelic
Traumadelic. Yeah.
culture. We can get into that more. For me, that's a piece of it. The traumadelic culture. For me, it's more like this drama triangle victim culture where, like with the whole culture. Again, this is part of the product that happens when you've got this, neoliberalism on steroids and consumerism, that everybody turns into objects and material soulless creatures. And what happens? How do you connect when you're a soulless material creature? The only way you connect is in what people have talked about in the 60s and 70s, these more hipper mental health professors talked about the drama triangle, which the traumadelic culture, the victim culture, is like one part of it. But in
Mm.
that drama culture, the only way that people bond in these sick societies, sick families, is you're either a victim, you're a rescuer, you're a hero, or you're a persecutor. Okay.
Bruce Levine, great to have you back on the podcast.
Great to be back, Brian.
Well, man, I just got to say, I really appreciate your writing, and I love how you come from a place of like real experience. You're a clinical psychologist. You've been doing the work for a long time, but you don't pull any punches in your critique of what's going on in the whole psychopharmaceutical business, the mental health industry, and I just find it really refreshing. So thank you for that, first of all.
Well, thank you. That's good to hear.
Yeah, I mean, it really you kind of help support my own critiques, what I've been seeing, in my work and involvement with the world of psychedelics and healing and all of that. And you bring a lot of kind of weight to my own arguments, so I appreciate that.
Well, that's really for me. If people don't halfway get it already, it's going to be hard for me to talk to them. And so a lot of what I do is people who already kind of get it halfway or three-quarters of the way, but they haven't had the time to do the research. And so I just kind of help validate what they're already intuiting. That's I feel like, one of the things I'm of use for on the planet.
Yeah, well, and like the way you write too, I mean, like you just it's like street language, straight and to the point. You're not afraid to use forceful language. So it comes across as like a strong position, which I always enjoy.
Well, I've learned a lot of my influences in writing. I mean, for example, not that George Orwell was a great across the board, but his writing on writing is pretty good. And I was just thinking about it more recently with this psychobabble and biobabble having to do with ketamine. That's the newest thing I'm writing about. But it's one of his essays on politics in the English language is pretty compelling, and there's a lot of different parts of it. But for him, he was very wary of jargon, and so I am too. And that's part of hopefully we can help get your audience who's already intuiting these guys are BSing a lot, bullshitting a lot. To recognize when they're hearing jargon, when they're hearing nine-syllable words for one-syllable words, when they're hearing too much, and we go through some of the jargon having to do with the ketamine stuff is just off the charts. But it's designed to intimidate and people who don't know or feel intimidated by science, and they hear these terms that they've never heard before, and they go like, "Well, these people must know what they're talking about." Well, that's the game that these people do. They don't know what the heck they're talking about, or they're outright lying, and they'll use these jargon things that people are unfamiliar with to influence, intimidate, control. And so that's part of, like, I know a guy like you does this, and that's part of what I feel like my obligation is to help people to cut through the jargon here, whether it's, like I say, the psycho jargon. Nowadays you got a lot of bio babble along with psychobabble, and people need help with that. And a lot of people are smart, but they just don't have enough time to be confident of what stuff they're hearing is actually new and worth stuff versus what is that somebody's utilizing the authority of the era, which, utilizing science, utilizing these things to kind of con and control people. So it's a big
Hmm.
deal, I think.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Yeah, that any kind of jargon is often used to obfuscate and to, like you said, enforce a position of authority. And it is intimidating sometimes. It's like, yeah, maybe then the kind of the default response is, well, you just kind of concede to these people because, well, they obviously are talking about stuff that I don't really understand. So that's a really good point. And so, yeah, good to cut through the bullshit. Um, we're going to talk about your latest article, which goes into the use of ketamine for mental health treatment, particularly for depression. But I thought, like, first, it could be helpful to start with just like a lay of the land. Your article previous to that one, late last year, I think did a really good job of that. And I just want to like read a little passage that resonated with me because it really mirrors a critique that one of my heroes, James Hillman, made in starting in the 90s in his critique of psychology and therapy professions. Um, so if you don't mind, I know it could be a little uncomfortable me reading your own words back to you, but just indulge me for the sake of the
It's
audience here.
okay. I don't mind.
I just thought it was like it's just such a succinct kind of summation of like what's kind of going wrong with the
By the
whole
way, most
system.
writers don't mind at all having somebody read their words. I should tell you
Okay,
that.
cool.
Go ahead.
All right. So you wrote, the more that Americans have bought the idea that there is an epidemic of mental illness which requires greater access to treatment, the more fucked up we're all getting, and the more we enable a fucked up society to become increasingly more so. Not only is psychiatric treatment, which for most patients means psychiatric drugs, are they not helping many of them while making some feel even worse? We have also been sidetracked from examining what it is about society that is fucking up so many of us, and we've been diverted from pursuing those nooks and crannies that have yet to be dehumanized. Yeah.
Sounds right. I try not to use the curse words too much, but they just I can only restrict it to about three. I think my first draft of that paragraph I had about double that amount.
Well, things are really fucked up. You know,
Because they are. I mean, that is the state of things. We have, I mean, I guess more politely, we could call it an insane society and an insane psychiatry, an insane treatment, or we could just talk more colloquially, and it's fucked up.
yeah. Well, Hillman with his book with the writer Michael Ventura back in the 90s, he called it we've had 100 years of psychotherapy and the world's getting worse. And I've been kind of like following that and saying, well, we've had like 50 or 60 years of psychopharmacology and the world's getting even worse.
Right.
And you could say even more fucked up. So, like, let's have a look at it because all the
Right.
numbers
And
point in that direction that something's not working, right?
Right. And, as we talked about last time, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, there, of all the reasons that maintain a psychiatry, none of which have to do with science because they've been wrong about everything, their theories, their treatment outcomes, their DSM. So, of the many, many reasons that maintain their authority, besides drug company money and advertising on the mainstream media, a lot of it is that the powers to be, whether they're Elon Musk or Bill Gates or all of these folks, the top 1%, they want people to believe that the reason why they are feeling anxious, depressed, substance abusing, obsessive compulsive, whatever, that they want people to believe it has to do with them, that they have some sort of individual defect, that there's something biologically, chemically wrong with them. And so therefore psychiatry, that's a big their role in the insane wheel, in their spoke of the insane wheel is they serve the ruling class in that way to give them all of these different ideas, and they keep changing. So like I've written a lot lately and lately, about I've over the years about the chemical imbalance theory, about how that's been disproved by the 1980s that there was no relationship at all between serotonin levels and depression. And more recently 2020, actually within the last couple of weeks, Joanna Moncrief, the psychiatrist who did the big review article on it in 2022 that just totally put the final nails in this serotonin imbalance coffin, and she got beat up on by psychiatry for all kinds of bizarre reasons. Once that happened, they were looking for something else, and that's what they've been doing for the last 10 years, coming up with other kind of things. So you have their circuitry defect things. I mean, their justifications, their biochemical justifications for ketamine are laughable, and we'll maybe talk a little bit about that later. But it's again these things where you got these, whether they're commercials or these academics going, well, we think it's this, we think it's that. Just like they said, well, we think depression's related to the serotonin imbalance, and it works. It gives people, for a variety of reasons, these things are going to work, and they'll just keep switching it every 10, 20 years. And so sometimes I feel like, well, I feel it's important that we do this kind of thing, but sometimes I have to tell you, it feels like the myth of Sisyphus. It feels like I'm like pushing the boulder up and it's getting pushed down. Or more recently, I've been just thinking about it's like whack-a-mole. Every time they come up with a theory, we spend a bunch of years knocking it down, but something else more idiotic pops up, and that's going to always happen. We're not going, and we can get into the reasons why we're never going to be able to. I don't think guys like me are going to never stop this process as long as we have this insane, crazy society and culture. But I feel still an obligation for people who are the critical thinkers out there, whether they're 5% or 20% of the society, to validate what their intuitions are already telling them.
Hey, I want to take a moment to speak with you about this channel. Currently, only 11% of viewers are subscribed to the channel. I think those numbers are terrible. So if you're enjoying this content and you want to help out the channel, please take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe. And if you really want to help out the channel, you can become a member of the Howl in the Wilderness Patreon, which will give you access to early release of full ad-free episodes, plus access to the archive of the first 100 episodes of this podcast. It would really help me out and allow me to keep creating content like the interview that you're watching right now. Okay, thanks so much. Now, back to the interview. Yeah, that a lot of these symptoms are, I think, like in a lot of ways, completely valid response to the state of the world and our kind of Anglo-North American culture. Just to speak for this part of the world, that, yeah, of course, people are feeling depressed and anxious and despairing and all of that because you look out into the world and there's not a whole lot to make you feel hopeful or good about the way things are.
Right, right. I mean, a big thing that I think to help people is forget about using the term symptoms. These are reactions. These are
Right,
humans'
right.
reactions to, and for me, I'm uncomfortable around people who don't have some degree of depression, some degree of anxiety. I mean, they're not paying attention, or they're insensitive, or there's something problematic. Especially here in the States. Just the politics at the top, but not just that. Just this ketamine billboards, and when you've got a drug that's not even FDA approved, and they're using it for everything inside, and not FDA approved for any kind of psychiatric disorder. I should say it's an anesthetic. It's approved for anesthesia, for as an anesthetic, and then we'll talk about why they're able to use it everywhere else. But you've got different spokes in the wheel, from the guys who are running this country at the top now here in the States, to you have prisons for profit. I remember finding out about that about 25 years ago. Like, who thought of this idea? That could be a good idea, that you've got giant corporations who are making more money the more people are thrown in prison. And so you've got, I mean, we can go on and on. I'm sure you can contribute, your audience can contribute their particular spokes in the wheel, but they all go together, because once you have the hub of the wheel is basically insane or fucked up, or whatever terms you want to use it, materialistic, consumeristic, transactional. There's a lot of different terms for like this utter insanity that we have here. Capitalism on steroids, neoliberalism, craziness. Once you've got that anything else, all these spokes that fit into that, and including our school system, they all are have to be insane. They just can't. Anything that actually is sane is going to like make everything else look bad. So they all have to fit together in this crazy puzzle.
Yeah, yeah. And the way I kind of look at it sometimes is that, these, let's just keep it with like psychiatry. It's a product of a sick culture. So of course it's going to be shaped by that culture and meant to kind of serve that culture in perpetuating it. Like you said, it's a spoke in this larger wheel, or this cog in a larger mega machine, as you've called it elsewhere. So it's like, for me, it's like a bit of a no-brainer. Like if you can take a step back and look at things critically, it all makes sense in how it's all interconnected, and each spoke supports the other, or supports the wheel of the machine.
Right, and
But
that's Oh, I
Hmm.
mean, I was gonna say that's why once people get it in one area of their life, so way back in the 60s and 70s, a lot of people were getting about the problem of standard schooling, that it was not really educating people. In fact, it was turning a lot of people off to their curiosity and seeking knowledge. And once people got whatever you want to call radicalized about like that standard schooling had very little to do. In fact, it was counter education for a lot of people. Then they were able to go like, wow, if something's that big and crazy, maybe there's other things. So I think part of what happens is once you get it in one giant area, and I think that's partly, like what happens for people on a political level. They see, I remember a few years back, I was writing about our elections here in the States for president, and this was when Hillary Clinton was running against Trump. And I took a look at the two most disliked people, along with Bill Cosby. Those were the three most on opinion polls, the people who had the lowest personal approval trust ratings. So you had two out of the three people. These are the people you were getting forced to choose for president of the United States. And I was going like, this is like, does anybody see how incredibly insane? You're not talking about the ordinarily lesser of two evils. I mean, this is the lesser of really two people, the two people that the two of the three people that people most despise. And these are the people that you're being. So we can go on at different levels. But I think once you get you get that sense of like, holy cow, this is like entirely crazy. Then you're more open to the idea that that lots of other giant institutions are working against what they say. Like you have a lot of, or again, to talk about Orwell, a lot of things like the Defense Department is really the War Department, and everything is sort of like backwards. People are talking in schooling or anti-education. My mental health profession is creating more emotional suffering. There's a lot of these kind of insane things that makes sense for people in terms of money making, control, power. So the logic of how all of these things maintain itself has to do with politics and money. It doesn't have anything to do with
Hmm.
science and truth and justice and all those things we'd like to have our society arranged on.
Yeah, it's like money and power that keep the wheel turning. Um, okay, one of the things that you wrote about in the ketamine article is this history of the magic bullet treatments. I wonder if you could just kind of lay that out for people.
Right. I think this is really important. And I hope we will have time to actually get into a lot. I know what you care about, the traumanoid culture, because I think it all relates and all connects up. But the magic bullet has always been something psychiatry's fantasy. And it goes back to like even Freud, in the 1880s, he actually was depressed. So it was for personal reasons, but also he was desperate to be a famous guy. And he
Hmm.
came up with cocaine. And it worked great in the beginning. I mean, there's great quotes about from Freud saying, calling it a magical substance, talking about it like, I gave him this like unbelievably wonderful experience. And he thought he was found something that was going to be the ultimate magic bullet. And of course, I mean, to Freud's credit was that eventually, and it took a while though, that when he saw the problems that it was causing to people he knew, people he was prescribing to, he said he backed off and he realized, well, I'm going to go get my fame in something else. And so he moved into the things that he's famous for, psychoanalysis and ego, superego, and Oedipus complex, and all that stuff that he became famous for. But that feeling, that desire for the magic bullet. In Freud's case, it was much more, I think, ego, and it didn't have to do with money. Then you end up in the 50 years later, you have the amphetamine. What's their next real magic bullet is the amphetamines get invented in the 30s, and so Benzedrine is the magic bullet. And in Germany they're using methamphetamine, Pervitin. It's like it helps for a couple of days. I mean, it's what they were using to invade France in a couple of days. It didn't work so great when they tried to take over Russia, by the way, because it doesn't work long term. But
Hmm.
anyways, so that's in the 30s, and then they move on that, and then they're seeing they finally, oh, well, there's some downsides to the speed. People get addictive, and people, so they move on to the next magic bullets, and they move on to these so-called antidepressants, and that's just really the name antidepressants is not even accurate because they do many more problematic things than they help with depression. But the first group they have these called tricyclic antidepressants, and which are things like Tafranil and Elavil and that sort of thing. And then they moved on to this stuff because they come up with these theories that like, wow, depression is caused by these neurotransmitters. If it's not norepinephrine, it's serotonin, or maybe it's both. And this was their new exciting theories. And so really they shut down the idea that depression, as I was talking about earlier, has anything to do do with serotonin was just not, it was just they did the research. We could go into detail in the research, and if you want to, but it was already in the 1980s. They kind of knew this, that it was you got to discard this theory. But when Prozac came out in the late 1980s, it was viewed as a serotonin reuptake inhibitor that creates more serotonin in the synapse, and they revived these theories. And so you'd see on these commercials, we think, and these academics that became part of this industry. So in all of these things, you have the psychopharmaceutical company, in the industry in complex. You have academics also involved who are doing research, and everybody's getting excited about this chemical
Hmm.
imbalance theory. So finally, after years, and also two of these drugs finally go off patent. So instead of, they're not making 5-10 billion a year off of these drugs. So all of a sudden now, around this started about 10 years ago, people were admitting more and more that the serotonin imbalance theory wasn't true, and they were getting ready people for the next wave of the new drugs. And as we talked about a little bit earlier, you and I, was that was when psychedelics became having this popular allure. And so again, psychiatry was going to try to figure out a way how we could co-opt this stuff, how we could kind of medicalize this stuff, and that is created all kinds of problems, which we could get into. But the most monumentally insane problem here is the ketamine. Okay,
Hmm.
which has really been the major industry. That's the industry that by the end of this decade, they're talking about it being a $6-7 billion a year industry. That's the one where we've got ketamine clinics left and right. That's the one. By the way, I should tell you just a brief tangent why I did that article. Part of me was going like, I'm kind of getting tired of debunking all this bullshit. I've been doing it for too long. But some client comes to my office with a picture on her cell phone of a giant ketamine billboard in Cincinnati, or like on the just east of Cincinnati. And they're talking about it for everything, like they always do, for depression, anxiety, PTSD, obsessive compulsive disorder. And these guys, these ketamine clinic guys are 24 hours, 48 hours in your instant cure to your depression. So they really are advertising it as a magic bullet. So I said, okay, here we go again. I got to get back into talking about this stuff and discussing it. But and hopefully we'll do some, we'll do some of it here just so people get a sense.
Hmm.
It's just the same old bullshit, different, slightly different, in some ways more insane. I should say, just as I'm on this thing, why I say more insane is because the other drugs, the SSRIs, all those other drugs, they had FDA approval. Okay, Food and Drug Administration approval. Now, that doesn't mean that much. To get that, we can talk about how easy it is to get that, and pharmaceutical companies can't control the research, and in a lot of ways, that's nothing to be proud of here. But at least it's something. Now, we have this ketamine industry here, and the FDA has actually issued warnings over and over again saying, look, this stuff is not approved for any psychiatric disorder. And I'm going like, most people I tell that to, they go like, well, how the hell can people use it? How can people advertise on giant billboards? It's not even FDA approved for anything. And so a lot of people are getting radicalized. That feels insane for a lot of people. Now, people who are in medicine, they're not so, they know that you're allowed, these doctors are allowed, once a drug is approved for anything. And ketamine is a useful anesthetic in certain conditions. And so once it's approved for anything, these doctors can use it for anything. And that's the reason why you've got these giant ketamine industry. It's in the States what you call a Schedule 3 drug, like steroids. It's in that category, as opposed to LSD and ayahuasca or Schedule 1 drugs. So that makes it easy. These guys can prescribe it off label. It also creates a whole academic industry. It's easy for them to get their hands on it to do research. So there's tons more bogus, not great research, except the one research study, a couple that I quote in that article, that are not done by people who have conflicts of interest. And so there's a lot of the reasons why you're hearing why ketamine more than the other things, which are, by the way, as you and I, this is a completely different category. People are conflating ketamine with the real psychedelics, right? Like
Hmm.
ayahuasca and all. They're conflating these things. Ketamine is this anesthetic, dissociative anesthetic, that's highly addictive, that we know causes organ damage in people who are using it a lot recreationally. It's very, very different category. And so here you got the more dangerous, more problematic drug is being like used. Why, again, to repeat myself, because it meets that off-label loophole, because it's already FDA approved. These doctors are using it. And this is sort of a funny tangent for me is like the big battle that's going on in medicine. These psychiatrists are really pissed off because they don't have a monopoly in medicine. A lot of these anesthesiologists are setting up their own clinic and
Yeah,
or ER docs, and they're going like, why the hell should you guys make all this easy money off this stuff? And there's a lot of money to be made. We can go
yeah.
through the finances of this later if you're interested in. So I'm going on and on here, but that's like for me, the insanity level has actually jacked up with ketamine as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And I've kind of like seen it from the inside too. Like I've had a couple clients who are nurse practitioners in the States, and they're interested in alternative forms of therapy. So they're interested in psychedelics. And ketamine, like you said, has been able to be kind of pushed through all of the loopholes so that people can start to open up these independent
Mm-hmm.
ketamine clinics. And it's like some guy who gets turned on to this, who's been a businessman in some other realm, real estate or something else, gets this idea that he's going to open up a clinic. So he hires an anesthesiologist, a nurse practitioner, and it sounds like that's kind of all you need to get it up and running. And like what I've heard is that a lot of these guys end up addicted to the ketamine. They're dipping into the supply. And it's really all about just getting people in and out of that clinic. Like just the turnover rate is insane. And so the people working the clinics are like super overworked. They're like burnt out. But it's like, how much money can we make as fast as we can before, I don't know, the jig is up or something? And I started to get really concerned about it when not only hearing these stories anecdotally, but when I was training with Gabor Mate, who's a very famous, influential person, about 5 years ago, I was training with him. And in one of our practitioner supervision calls, one of the practitioners was complaining about her feelings of dissociation from her body. And almost immediately, he suggested that she try ketamine. And when I interjected and said, well, hey, like, is it smart to suggest ketamine for someone experiencing dissociation because it's a dissociative anesthetic?
Yeah, really.
And he got like really angry with me and he shut it down and said, that's not how it works. And that was like no more no conversation about it at all. And I just thought it's so bizarre. And, as I started to write a little bit about it and kind of pushing back on all the propaganda and evangelism, well, I don't know, people really promoting it and getting really
Right. It
behind
is
it as this,
evangelical. I agree.
it's kind of, yeah, that's the way I see it anyway. But when I started to like put some stuff out there that's like a little, just asking questions, like, I got a lot of pushback from people, and it started to, I realized like if people are getting that triggered and that defensive about something, they're either like caught in a belief system or they're dependent on this substance. Like it's the only time I see people get really reactively defensive about something is when there's like there's high stakes for them in supporting this thing and not questioning it, right?
Right. Right. No, I mean, it's really wild. I mean, in terms of, like I said, to just trying to the insanity level of ketamine is because not only is it not FDA approved, we're talking about the infusions that they're making the big money in the clinic. We could talk about this little S-ketamine and spravato later if
Yeah.
you're interested in. That's a whole other racket. But what we're talking about the big money, these infusions, the stuff that and so you've got these on every level, you've got these famous, Hollywood person who's, getting addicted to it. And they're saying it's not addictive while people are like hearing stories that
Mm.
people are using it 6 to 8 times. This Matthew Perry guy is like, he's using it 6 to 8 times a day. Was he curious 6 to 8 times a day? I
Yeah.
mean, they're claiming it's not addictive. I mean, the other stuff that's really kind of was really frightening for me is that, and this is what they always do to kind of sort of legitimize stuff, they start talking about these underlying these biochemical issues. And so you're hearing more and more, instead of talking about serotonin levels, you hear them talking more about, well, glutamate and NMDA. And they're talking about, literally, they use terms like, well, depression is caused by, it's problems in your circuits and your neurons. And there's no evidence of this. We can talk about that specifically later. There's nothing of that. And they're talking about, and you listen, there's one place I hyperlinked to in that article, Yale. They're like the epicenter academically, because that was one of the first places they did this 7 subject study on people with ketamine, and they had these miracle cures, in a few days, and then it disappeared in a couple of weeks, of course. But that's so Yale's become like sort of the academic epicenter, and these guys are using they're talking about we think. The academics will say we think, as opposed to the clinics things. If you go on the YouTube, like all the videos on YouTube, the clinics, they don't bother with we think, but the academics will say that, and they'll say, well, we think it regrows, it grows synapses,
Hmm.
and creates circuits, and then they even I saw I had to, I don't know whether to laugh or cry, but they'll use terms like, literally, it's not enough to say regrow circuits. Now they're talking about synaptic genesis. What the heck is this, biblical here? I saw a one recently. I saw neural fertilizer. They were calling ketamine a neural fertilizer. I guess I don't know what they haven't called it organic fertilizer yet. I don't. But it's like again, what's happening is like, let's get these academics involved to try to create some biological legitimacy, which is also with bullshit about what depression is, what this ketamine is doing. There's no evidence at all that it's helping. In fact, it's just the opposite. The evidence is all on the other side, that it's neurotoxic, that these Dutch research, by the way, everything that I'm talking about here today, people can go to that article and they can hyperlink to the actual research here. But Dutch researchers have found, and this is with recreational users. I don't mean to scare people who've just used ketamine as an anesthetic properly, but people, recreational users, that they see damage to a white, a gray matter in your brain. There's all kinds of. There's a guy I quote in the article is Caleb Alexander. Again, no financial conflicts of interest, who is co-director at Johns Hopkins at their Center for Drug Effectiveness and Safety. And he's talking about, look, if you look at the research here, they're all like short-term, small subjects. It's all like, it's either, or if it's not, there's not binded, it's not really controlled, there's conflicts of interest. He's going, and the only thing that we really know is this: ketamine is very risky, and he talks about it, damaging, toxic to neurons. So it's and this
Hmm.
again, the insanity is these guys are in pure Orwellian fashion. They're flipping the script here, saying this stuff improves your
Right.
neurons, when it's just actually, and also too. As I'm ranting and raving here, let me get this stuff out there, because it's just like, I mean, when I was done with this piece, I went to YouTube and I just put in ketamine depression, and I could not, one highly polished video after another, talking about how wonderful and great this was, mostly from clinics, but some of these academics. And I had to go for a long time to get to a lot of ones coming out of the UK, where
Hmm.
they were talking about, the real serious problems. They were talking about ketamine bladder. I've talked about a lot of people here in the States, they've never heard of cystitis, ketamine bladder, and how, like, recreational users, people in the UK, they know this, like 30% of these folks, and a lot of these videos they were interviewing urologists who were saying, yeah, we've had to pull some people's bladders. They've been so damaged by this stuff. So, here's the stuff. And that's what I think in the end, what these clinics are going to go down with. I mean,
Hmm.
I don't know what kind of malpractice insurance they're paying, but I wonder how much they're disclosing all of these different potential adverse effects. And then, as I talk about in the article, and if you're interested, we could get to it here, in terms of its actual effectiveness, when you do real science on it, that's not there either. Okay, if you do real science, even in the short term, but definitely in the long term, there's no evidence of this really being this magic bullet. But we can get into all that. But maybe more interesting, whatever you want to talk about, Brian. But the whole
Hmm.
idea of why we cling to magic bullets in psychiatry and a lot of other parts of our life has to do with this craziness of our culture in general.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I knew you'd come loaded up, and I just gotta let you rip. Yeah, I found an article from like a few years ago in the Guardian, UK publication, and like you said, it was starting to come out that young men who are regular ketamine users, because it is addictive, and were experiencing these like ulcers in the bladder, and their
Right,
bladder was reduced to like 10% of its function, and they're having to wear
right.
diapers and all this stuff, and like completely debilitated. And one of the guys was saying that his doctor told him, well, look, you picked the one drug that actually like ruins the body, and this is not something you hear about at all. I've never heard anyone
Right.
promoting ketamine as a treatment talk about these adverse effects. So it's being buried by all of the kind of positive press and the evangelicizing and all of it, right? Like you
Right.
said, you got to like really get down to the second or third page of results before you start seeing anything that contradicts all of this positive press. Like one of the things, I came up, I was 16 in 1990, and there was a kind of a psychedelic drug revival in the 90s. It was like that 30-year cycle thing. The 60s came back again, and Terence McKenna was on the scene, and Leary was kind of like being, rediscovered. And so I was, using like psilocybin mushrooms and LSD, experimenting with everyone else in my peer group. And ketamine was one of these drugs that came up, and I always thought it was so weird. People are using, we called it like the the cat tranquilizer. I don't
Right.
know if we knew
Right.
really what it was, but it was something that
Right.
was like used for anesthesia. And people were like talking about like the K-holes that they'd fall into and
Right.
all this. So then when I saw ketamine come back as this medical treatment, I was like, what the, this is like a club drug. You fall into K-holes. It's no good. Like who's behind this kind of revival of ketamine as a psychiatric treatment? Like, do you know like where that started? Like who was kind of behind the revival of it? Because we can talk about MDMA and Rick Doblin as being a major force behind that. But
Mhm.
like how did ketamine come back on the scene in this way?
I think it's pretty simple. I think it's like what happened was they conflated all of these. They conflated the ketamine with ayahuasca and LSD and shrooms and put through them in that same category of being a psychedelic. And then people knew that there was, with these antidepressant drugs, these SSRIs failing for lots of folks, they were looking for, these something with a more popular allure. Okay, so that's step one. And then step two is the key thing, as I said previously, was that ketamine, unlike all, ayahuasca and shrooms and all those things, ketamine is a Schedule 3 drug, which means it can be prescribed. And so that's the key thing. These clinics know that they're not going to, get busted by the cops for for prescribing, because these doctors can do whatever they want, prescribe off-label. So that off-label loophole is dramatic in terms of creating the ketamine industry. And part of also to that off-label loophole has made it easier for these researchers who want to publish, like, terrified of not publishing, not perishing, publish or perish thing. And so,
Mm.
so there's a lot more research going on in that whole academia about ketamine, because it's easier for them to get a hold of that stuff. They don't have to, go through hoops to get a hold of it to do their research. So there's a combination
Hmm.
of forces out there, but a lot of it has to do with just the DEA, scheduling of it, that as opposed to, and again, the insanity is you've got, I think, marijuana
Yeah.
is, last time I looked, they still, that's still a Schedule 1 drug. So you've got drugs, and these drugs that are like, no one, people can put down in your notes there and tell me I'm wrong here, show me research, but no one, I've never seen anything about, shrooms or ayahuasca causing kidney, bladder, ketamine bladder and cystitis is what they call it, ulcerative cystitis, or any kind of organ damage. I've not seen anything about it being addictive. And so they picked the most dangerous drug here. And again, without any evidence, really, real evidence of it being effective. And I go through
Mm.
that in the article. People can read the article, but when somebody over at Stanford, this group of folks who don't have any financial conflicts of interest, did science correctly, another had a real kind of active placebo control, a group of depressed people who, one group is, they're all going under surgery, and some of them get the ketamine, some other gets an anesthetic. No difference between these folks. And actually, after a week, it was actually the people with the who weren't doing the ketamine anesthetic actually were doing better. So we have, even in the short term, because for a long time people saying, okay, oh, it's great in the short term, we don't know how it's going to be in the long term. Well, this study showed that even in the short term, people, their depression scores went down. Okay, same would have happened if they would have done cocaine, heroin, or, it turns out, almost any anesthetic. Is that does
Yeah.
that So it just gets crazy, crazy. I should like add one last thing before I don't forget, because this is important. That in the beginning, when I would go through this research, I said, like, well, psychiatry, their standard of care is that we're allowed, if somebody's treatment-resistant depression, then we can move on to ketamine, or their other option is electroshock. Okay,
Right.
so What do they, so what qualifies a person out there for being treatment resistant depression? People should ask that question of their doctor. And the answer is if you failed two of these two of these antidepressants, whether it's SSRIs or SNRIs, Cymbalta, Prozac, whatever, you fail two, then boom, you get stamped as treatment resistant. Now that becomes another degree of insanity because we know scientifically these drugs are not really scientifically effective. So you fail two ineffective drugs, you get labeled treatment resistant depression, and your psychiatrist going, oh, should we send them for the electroshock or should we send them for the ketamine? It's just insanity piled upon insanity.
Yeah. Instead of like looking at the drugs and saying, well, it's the drugs that aren't working, it's like, no,
Right,
this person's got like treatment resistant depression. So again, it's on the individual. And then,
right.
okay, then I mean, it's surprising to people, I think, to hear that electroshock is still done. And there's only like a few countries, I think, that have outlawed it, right? Like it's more prevalent than you would think. It seems like something from like the 1940s or the Victorian era or something, but it's still happening.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
and just to say about like how kind of ketamine came onto the scene, like my experience again as like an insider is I've been asked over the years to consult with some psychedelic startups. And like the big goal maybe about like 5 or 6 years ago was okay, like MDMA is on the fast track to becoming approved for medical treatment, and so we're setting up all of these startups to begin like MDMA psychedelic therapy treatment centers, right? But
Hmm.
MDMA was kind of caught in this, I don't know, this process. But the money was already there. They'd already gotten money from investors to start up these clinics, and it was like, well, I mean, we can use ketamine until the MDMA is approved. So we're going to start out. Phase one is going to be ketamine clinics because we can do that now and we can start making money. And then when mushrooms or MDMA are approved, then we can incorporate those into the existing psychedelic treatment centers. So from my perspective, that was how it was being used, and that was already like raising a lot of red flags for me. Is that it was clearly about money and about utilizing this investment money that was already pouring in because there was so much excitement about this potential to have psychedelic treatment centers all over the country. But like ketamine was the one thing you could start using now and begin making money now. And people on the outside, they don't know that that's what's going on, that it's really
Right,
about
right,
money. It's not about helping
right.
people.
Right. Now, there's a lot, like the more interesting stuff, if you go down YouTube or some of these, Wall Street Journal kind of videos on ketamine and, why they're investing in that. And it is all about money. And these clinics, by the way, for people who are completely naive to what pricing is, if you go, there's chains. I mean, there's these ketamine chains, just like one of the big ones is called Stella. It's rebranded from another one. If you go to their website, they actually give pricing, and they talk about like you can get 6 sessions package for like somewhere 44, $4,500. That includes your therapy session with it, or you don't have to, you could forego your therapy session and you could just for $3,500 get your 6 sessions of ketamine. And it's incredible markup because those little vials of ketamine, they don't cost these guys that much. It's all patent, and I don't know what the heck these guys pay, 25, 30, but I don't know, not that much money for it. And so it's huge, and they've made that price is really high. And so, but there's other things these ketamine clinics too offer. Okay, so the other thing that is FDA approved, I should get to this, is that one of the things they were working on forever was like, how could we find a way to patent ketamine that's not really ketamine but is ketamine, so that we could patent it and then really make money off of that. And so Janssen, they were working on it. They were a part of Johnson Johnson's Janssen company, and they came up with this thing called esketamine, which the brand name of it is Spravato, and it probably one of the most controversial FDA procedures ever. Well, maybe not ever, but one of the most. This thing got approved, and I'll just give you briefly why it was so controversial, because I think this is really important. By the way, this is also really expensive. But they're hoping because it's FDA approved, they could get insurance companies to pay for it. Because the infusions that we're talking about before, they're not FDA approved. Insurance companies won't pay for it. This Spravato, which is a nasal spray of what esketamine, and just real quickly in the ketamine, you have these kind of mirror S-ketamine and R-ketamine. They're kind of molecular variations. Enantiomers is the fancy term, biological term for it. And so they took the one part, the S-ketamine, and they made this spravato thing. And so when they did the drug trials on it, they worked with Johnson Johnson's Janssen. They fast tracked this thing. So already, and people should know these, already real scientists have already been upset with the normal standard procedure of how antidepressants are approved, which require only two effective, better statistically than a placebo. The drug companies could do 1,000 studies and only find two, but that's good enough. And they have to be 6 to 8 weeks. All right. But worse with this Spravato was they fast tracked this thing and they only found one. So in the study that I talk about, the Moncrief, article that I talk about, the psychiatrist, that she went through the research and the publications that like 5 out of the 6 studies out there showed that there was no benefit statistically compared to a placebo for this Spravato. Okay. And of course, there's lots in the long-term studies on safety and problems with this is lots of problems with this Spravato. So, and also too, instead of the normal 6 to 8 week, and these antidepressants, by the way, 60% of Americans, according to CDC, are taking them for like at least 2 years. And so normally they only study them for 6 to 8 weeks, which is already egregious. But on this particular study, they just did it for 4 weeks. So too short, not really effective. And then even in the one study that they found it was more effective than a placebo, they dropped their standards. So it wasn't that much really more effective. So this is how but they got FDA approval on this Spravato. So these clinics, if you look at most of these clinics, that you can get either the infusions with or without your therapy. That the price range I talked about with before. You can go get your Spravato, or more and more. And this is the really crazy stuff. It gets crazier and crazier. You could get these prescribers online and get mailed to you these lozenges, these
Mm.
lollipop ketamine. I was like, going, are you kidding me? And so people are taking these things in their home. That's a big part of this ketamine industrial complex. And then, I could go on and on, but I just let me get this one last thing. All right. I was thinking about when I was done with this article, I was going, enough. This is just too crazy for words. But you know what? I'm going to talk on these podcasts, and some guy, maybe Brian, is going to say, Bruce, so tell me, are they prescribing this stuff with kids yet? And without doing any research on this stuff, my immediate answer would have been, the way these psychiatric drugs work, they start with adults, but eventually they move
Mm.
to kids. But no, it took me 5 minutes to find the clinics that's specialing right now in pediatric use of ketamine for kids with bipolar disorder. I mean, how much more of an insane society can you have than that? These poor kids, they're not making a choice for this stuff. It's bad enough that uninformed adults who are not being told the truth of these things are being shoved into this. But you're getting these kids taking this
Mm.
stuff.
Yeah, and they're already making, like you said, the lollipops.
Right. They got
It's
lollipop
like
lozenges. They put them
if
under
this
the tongue. You're supposed to put it under your tongue.
if this was in a movie 10 years ago, you'd say, "Oh, that's crazy,"
Exactly.
you know? But it's like it's being used as a kind of opiate of the masses. Um, one of the things that triggered a lot of people, like James Hillman was always good at kind of like taking another perspective on, just kind of like received wisdom about psychology, right? And so one of the things he talked about was like depression as a response to the ugliness of the world, that it's like an aesthetic response that the soul has
Right.
to the ugliness of the world. And so I put together this post and said, like, following this, if you believe this, if you go with this, is it any wonder that ketamine, an anesthetic, is like such a popular new treatment for depression? So the anesthetizing of the individual, what helps them cope with the world as it is, without like feeling the need to like actually change the thing that's affecting us so badly. And you talk about this in terms of like the sense of alienation and the dehumanizing that psychiatry is like complicit in. And so like one of the things I want to get to with you is like, okay, my God, it's all so fucked up, Like, what actually helps in your experience? Just to like kind of leave people with a glimmer of hope that like not all psychology, not all psychiatry, not all therapy is bad. Some of it actually helps. So, like, what in your experience are the things which help to people become, well, maybe like normalizing their alienation is a place to start. And it's like, no wonder you feel alienated. Me
Well,
too.
I think that's a great place to start. That, for people, and I do this all the time. I still see clients, and I go like, "Hey, you know, to not feel anxious, to not feel depressed, to not feel all of these things, it's like you've sort of probably extricated from your humanity some. I mean, there's just a ton at every level. There's the top level here politically that you see, especially here in the States. What's happened here and other parts of the world as well, but also, on every other level of their life. I mean, one of the most stressful things for most of the people in my clientele is not their health problems, it's their health care, their bureaucracies they have to
Mm,
deal with, their insurance companies, just all kinds of. So, one thing after another that people are having reactions to, and at the very least, if you want to do no harm as a therapist, is at least say, hey, you're not mentally ill, you're not defective, you don't have some kind of brain defect, circuitry problem, something like that, because you're having a normal human reaction. And then partially, a big part of what I try to do and help folks beyond that is help them say like, well, if the part of the problem that people have a lot is when that takes over your life, your sense that you're being fucked by life, you could
mm,
fuck yourself even more. And so a huge part of what I try to do with folks is to try to like say, hey, look, try to get that stuff at the periphery here, keep it over here, and try to have some life in your life, something that you really do care about, something that you really are interested in, that not only you feel like you're alive, that's something real that you can connect with other people with. So I have people who are like, in photography, in art, that just like whatever it is. Remember, problematically for some folks, they've lost what they really cared about. They've lost what they were really interested in. So we have to get that back. What was it you used to be interested in when you were a kid? So find out
yeah.
what you really made you feel alive, and then that can become a vehicle. And I see it all the time, at least with my clientele, that becomes a vehicle for them to connect with other people. So another way of putting it, try to reconnect with yourself, what was alive about you, what connect with your soul, and then that could become a vehicle to connect with other people. And you know what? The majority of society out there is absolutely in another plane. They're absolutely in this sort of consumeristic, materialistic, have as Fromm had the distinction to have or to be. They're in the have connect, or Martin Buber, they're in the I it. They're in this other zone, man. And you're gonna, if you, the more that you associate with that or take that seriously, you're gonna feel anxious, depressed until, and that's still good. That means you're still alive when you're feeling those things. The real scary thing is when you stop feeling those, and those psychiatrists, they'll help you get to that point in a hurry. That's what they're good at, numbing you so you don't feel anything. Then you really makes it harder. At least when you're anxious and depressed, you're a step closer to your own
Hmm.
humanity and to life around you. But they'll move you even further away. And I've had with those people who've been psychiatrized, for too many years, and it's a little more difficult to get back to who the hell they really are. So that's part of it. But the bigger,
Hmm.
there's other bigger issues that may be more fun for me to get to, of like why these. Well, let me stop there and
Yeah.
talk about what you want to talk about.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. It's really affirming my own view of things. Like I like the old model of looking at like it's the old idea is that, if somebody comes to the medicine man or woman and they talk about feeling depressed, listless, there's no passion, no interest in life, or they're overly anxious, they would say that they've suffered soul loss. And
Mm-hmm.
then, so what is the prescription there? Well, it's more soul. It's recovering soul. And that's kind of the language that I use to talk about what you're talking about, like connecting with
Mm-hmm.
like what's right around you in your immediate environment, what what you feel passionate about, what feels life-giving to you, life affirming. If you focus on that, And there's something like, and you said too, that I really have been thinking about lately is like the role of the outsider, and the outsider is maybe the healthiest position when we're in a really sick society. And so the outsider, the other, has been quite demonized in our culture. But I think like maybe that's the healthiest position, is to be like outside of the machine, focusing on like what's real and good in your life, and allowing the other stuff, like you said, to be kind of in the background of the periphery, but not always to feel like you need to opt in. In fact, like maybe some active resistance to all the inundation of information and the way the screens kind of like suck our attention and keep us away from doing those things that are like real and life affirming. So I'm right with you. I think that's like the prescription, is to help people connect to whatever makes them feel more human, and that involves
Hmm.
creativity, community involvement in the community, actually like making a difference in small ways in the face of what seems insurmountable. You know, this giant machine that just keeps like rolling on and rolling over us. To make those little changes, I think that's really, to me, like the only answer. And so, how do we get people more kind of politically engaged when there's all these, you know, things like the psychiatric drugs and all of that, which tend to keep us like infantilized or powerless? You know, I mean, that's not a question maybe that has like a direct, immediate answer, but I think that's a good question to kind of to live with or to consider. It's like, how do we connect people to life? How do we help them get more engaged, feel more empowered?
Well, I think a big part of it is for me is I don't waste my time. I got that many years left on the planet. I don't waste my time who like are completely don't get what the heck we're talking.
Mm,
And for me, it part of like for me, I think useful, incredibly useful, is to help people reframe these so-called symptoms of mental illness. That's a good starting point for a lot of folks to just have them reframe, and that's part of why it's important to delegitimize this whole psychiatric pharmaceutical industrial complex. That's an important thing for me to do. I don't just do it for kicks because I like cutting these people down to size. For me, by delegitimizing these guys, you're delegitimizing their name calling, their bigotry, their whatever the hell they're doing. That's getting
yeah.
people to think about their normal human reactions in a defective, problematic way, because that's really usually important. Once you start thinking about your anxiety, your depression as like a healthy reaction, okay, then you're opened up to thinking about like, well, what can I do? I mean, yeah, if I'm, maybe I'm so incredibly overwhelmed by it at this point in time, maybe I do need to fuck myself up a little bit, smoke a little bit of pot, but I know what I'm doing here. I'm not curing any kind of chemical imbalance here. I'm just accepting that in this point of my life, it's just so incredibly fucked up that the only way to get through here and get to this shitty job I hate is that I have to take the edge off with some pot. So,
Yeah, a
that's
little
what I have to do.
comfort.
Right, right. But you're not bullshitting yourself,
Yeah.
okay? And it's like you're on once, and you keep in your soul by being honest with yourself about what you're doing, and then you're thinking like, okay, hopefully you get to a certain point in your life that it's not so completely fucked up that maybe you can maybe move into a job or some other way of making a living or another kind of relationship that isn't so soul killing. All right.
Hmm.
That you recognize the different reasons why you are anxious and depressed. And then part of a good job of a good therapist, counselor, or friend, or whatever, is to kind of try to get people energized to take some risks. And part of what happens is when you lose your soul, you get weaker and you get more depressed and
Yeah.
whatever. It's harder to take that risk. It's harder to like try something that may be more soul affirming. So that's part of like what you want to surround yourself with, people who are energizing you to be more connected with life. So that's some of it. But a big part of it, like I said, the more general thing, and I think it's really important, is for people to really, really have in their heart that their culture, most of what they're hearing from the mainstream world, mainstream psychiatry, mainstream politics, mainstream media, it's just this kind of it's crazy ass insane kind of culture. This you call it the traumadelic
Traumadelic.
culture.
Yeah.
We can get into that more. For me, that's a piece of it. The traumadelic culture. For me, it's more like this drama triangle victim culture where like with the whole culture. Again, this is part of the product that happens when you've got this, neoliberalism on steroids and consumerism, that everybody turns into objects and material soulless creatures. And what happens? How do you connect when you're a soulless material creature? The only way you connect is in what people have talked about in the 60s and 70s, these more hipper mental health professors talked about the drama triangle, which the traumadelic culture, the victim culture, is like one part of it. But
Mm.
in that drama culture, the only way that people bond in these sick societies, sick families, is you're either a victim, you're a rescuer, you're a hero, or you're a persecutor. Okay. And
Yeah.
so those are your roles that you have in a sick culture. And that's part of it, just kind of complete the circle, part of like people's fantasy of the magic bullet. Okay, when you're totally beat up and you're totally moved into this victim, kind of person, your fantasy is that there's some magic bullet. It could be a magic bullet drug or a magic bullet politician, like we have here in the States here, who's running the show right now. They used to call them demagogues. These
Hmm.
are people who push magic bullets. That they got these solutions. They're going to take you out of your misery, take you out of your unhappiness, and boom, I can do it. I know how to do it. So
Well,
that's
and
go
let's
ahead.
not forget the self-help gurus who
Yes,
also, one of the ways I put it in my book Traumadelic is that on one hand they give you like their version of original sin, which is we all suffer from trauma and it's our job to redeem ourselves. And then on the other hand, they offer like the panacea, so you've got this like universal affliction of childhood trauma, and then you've got the universal cure, which is usually their form of trauma treatment,
right, right,
which
right.
costs money, and there's a whole pyramid scheme of training and all of that associated with it. And like, man, if you just because it's kind of like wrapped up in some kind of spiritual jargon
Right.
or nice gauzy feeling about it, doesn't mean that it's still not a product of neoliberal capitalism. Like in the end, it's up to you to do your work of healing your trauma.
It's really interesting for me. A lot of the folks across the bogus political spectrum, the bogus like left, right, they hate each other, and they're all really mirror image. A lot of them are mirror images.
No.
They a lot of them have like the victim cultures that they all believe in, like they've been victimized. And they all believe they're all looking for a hero, and they're all
Yeah.
moving around persecuting everybody, and they're all thinking that's what life is. And not and have no clue. Like that sucks. That just is not the way you want to really connect. There's nothing to do with caring, soul, love, and the way life
Dude,
feels like worth living.
that is like the shittiest cosmology I've ever heard, this trauma triangle. But it's
Right.
really what's going on. Like you said,
Right. By the
anybody,
way,
yeah.
oh no, by the way, that's not my creation. It's like what I should say, in the field that I went into, which was half crazy and half cool. Now it's all bullshit, almost all 98% bullshit. But in the 60s and 70s, there were a lot of thinkers, even psychiatrists, who were talking about interactional family systems, and even
Hmm.
psychiatrists. These guys were talking about interpersonal stuff. And one of these guys named Stephen Cartman was this guy come up with this simple, very simple concept that in these dysfunctional families the bonds were these. There was in these drama triangles is what he called them. That you had a victim, and you had these persecutor bullies, and you had the hero, and that he didn't go this far. But for me, that's if you take a look at the great demagogues through history, they encompass all three. From Hitler to the guy who's running the show now in America here, they're all three at the same time. They're the victim, they're the persecutor, and they're the and they're going to rescue you. and
Right. They're
and
the
that
savior.
captivates a sick culture, a sick society, sick people. And you see it. And I was talking about this with somebody who's really knew a lot about. I don't listen to Taylor Swift music. I'm just not my type here. But somebody I knew who analyzed her stuff and said, Bruce, what you're talking about, that's her. All her songs are about
Right.
people getting victimized, and she persecutes people and she bullies. And it's ironic, like she would hate the guy who's running the show here in America now. I guess they both hate each other, but they're both reflecting that kind of victim kind of culture here, and they're both doing the same thing. And that's part of why I go through this stuff, is the folks is like, you want to get outside of that. Okay,
Yeah.
it's you want to get outside of that as much as you possibly can, because that's the stuff that's going to make you sick, make you anxious, make you depressed, make you nasty, make you a jerk, all that kind of stuff. You want to be out of that to the extent that you can.
Hmm. Yeah. And with my orientation, I can't help but see the kind of like the religious undertones of this whole victim, savior, persecutor triangle. I mean, so in a culture that is kind of like post-religious in some ways, there is like a resurgence of religion in response to the
Hmm.
sickness of the culture, but there's
Hmm.
also these kind of stand-ins for religion. I mean, if Taylor Swift isn't a religious leader, I don't know what is. I mean, the Swifties are a cult.
Right, right,
Right. And so I
right.
think also, when somebody like Gabor Mate achieves this huge level of fame and success, he also becomes like a cult leader.
Hmm.
And everybody who follows him sees him as the ultimate authority, and they just swallow the dogma and they internalize it and they become informed by these theories, which, like you've been saying, don't have a lot of basis in reality. So I mean, if that's not a religion, I don't know what is.
Right, right, right. So you want to, again, to kind of help people out there who've got a brain in their head and they're getting what we're talking about here is there is no magic bullet to
Mm,
depression or anxiety. You sink into a deep hole and there's ways to kind of climb out of it slowly, and there's things that you can do that help you climb out of it. Some people get so fucked that they just can't. They can't ever climb out. Once you got down so deep, and especially if you're doing too many psychiatric drugs, too much heroin for too long, and you've just lost connection to who the hell you are in your soul. It's possible you and I, every human being could get down to the point where, you're too far gone. I know that's something people don't want to hear, but not most people are not that. I've not run into many people like that. I've run into some people, especially the people who are lucky enough to still feel anxiety, lucky enough to
mm,
still feel
mm.
some anxiety and depression. It's saying their soul is speaking, and there's different things that you can do to act on that slowly but surely. Whatever strength you have, you can do some more connecting to yourself, more connecting to other people. But there is no goddamn magic bullet, person, drug, whoever, guru, anything like that. And once you buy into that, you bought into the drama triangle. You bought into this kind of idiotic hero idea that somebody's going to save your ass, and you're gone.
Hmm. Yeah. One of the things that has influenced me from James Hillman and other kind of post-Jungian depth psychologists is the idea that the symptom, what's called the psychopathology, if we look at the etymology of that, it's like the suffering or the cry of the suffering soul. Psychopathosology. It's
Right.
looking at that in that way, kind of totally changes the way you look at these symptoms. And when you see treatments that are looking to get away with the symptoms, it's like you're quieting that cry of the suffering soul. So you're not listening to like why the depression, why the anxiety, which gets into some of the larger issues that we've been talking about. Like, well, it's a valid response to this really fucked up world that we're living in? And I
Right.
think like that's all a part of it is like numbing, getting rid of the symptom is part of like why it's not helping because it's not getting to the it's not listening to the symptom and following the symptom to find out like why that person is suffering so deeply. And then applying treatment to that, whatever that is. And I think it has a lot to do with, some of the alternatives that we've been talking about, community, finding something passionate, finding a cause that you believe in, that is like local. Like part of the feeling of alienation is that we're not always like locally active in our politics or in our community. And that's something that all can do to help move things in a more positive direction. And to me, that's empowerment.
Right, right. And these emotions that you have, they're fuels that can generate some actions that can be positive. I give you even anger. I mean, the mental health professional, I mean, they hate anger. They can't deal with
Mm,
that stuff at all. And actually, I was talking to one person who'd been psychiatrically hospitalized about 12 times, until I met them, and they were doing fine for the last 10, 12 years because they had nothing to do with psychiatry and their medication. They had this job, they were fine with life. And what they said to me, what this woman said to me, she says, you know what, Bruce? Their problem was they hated my feelings, and I think they hated my feelings because they hated their own feelings. And I said, wow, that's deep. And then sometime later, about a couple months later, I just said something. I realized, I got a lot of anger, And I said, you think I got a lot of anger with these bastards, 'cause they fuck with you. They fuck with so many people, set their life back years with their numbing bullshit that they've done.
Hmm.
And I said, I said to this person, you think I need to let go of my anger? That's the kind of therapy I do. I'll ask people, like, when I realize it's oozing out of me, I'll say, well, what do you think? You think I need to let go of my anger? And this person said to me, says, you know what? I think you can let go of your anger when they stop hurting people. And I said, oh,
Oh,
thanks.
yeah.
So, part of, like, you got to obviously, lashing out with your anger problematically, using it against people who don't deserve it, and,
Hmm.
being out of control with it is definitely not going to lend itself to a happy life. But anger can be a fuel. I mean, any political activist, of any fame has had a lot of anger in terms of the oppression and injustices that their friends or they suffered, and so they've taken that anger and they've used it as a fuel to
Yeah.
try to create a better society.
Yeah. Well, following that, one of my favorite sages and prophets, Johnny Rotten, aka John Lydon, said, "Anger is an energy." And
Right,
that's what I always try to help people remember, that the anger is not wrong. But let's find out like what you're really angry about. So you're not
right,
taking it out on the dog or on your kids or on the,
right,
the dishes or whatever it is, right?
right,
And like
right.
like you said, let's channel it in a positive direction, because it's there for a reason. It's usually a response to some injustice or a boundary that's been crossed. So the anger is that there's an intelligence to it. It's just that, it's been demonized so much that we just want to get rid of it. And but like, like Freud said, the return of the repressed, it's going to come back in some way. So let's leave it with that, like just like affirming people's anger over what's going on in this fucked up world. And yes, you should be angry, but
Right,
instead of pointing at each other, like let's channel it in the right direction.
right.
So, Bruce, man, it's always great talking to you. And I know as you keep writing, you're not going to be able to stop, by the way. I don't think so. But as you keep writing, there's going to be more topics I'm going to want to check in on with you. So it'd be great to have you back down the road.
Okay, this was fun, and I'll be glad to come back to you again down in the future there.
See what's next. See
I don't
what
know
the next.
how much crazier the world will get. Where they're going to move on for the next point. Okay.
Yeah, see what the next gopher that pops up that we gotta like whack down.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Take it easy, man. Take
All
care.
right. You too. You
Bye
too.
bye.